varies as to what their opinion would have been of Jesus and why it was such a stumbling block to proclaim that this man was the Messiah and was God's son. So you talked a lot about that, and then most of what was the rest of class was this idea of the years right after Paul's conversion. I started at the bottom of page 2. And it's a lot of history, jumping back and forth, this reference, comparing years and trying to figure out what goes on. But the point that I want you to understand is, when we're reading through the book of Acts, what's your impression that this is all happening in a pretty short window of time? Yeah, you read this and it seems like, okay, this happened right after this, and right after this, and right after this, and right after this. But that's not the case at all. Because Luke is obviously, he's giving us a select view of events. We're not even told everything that Paul does. I mean, we'll discuss that a little bit tonight. We're just sort of given the highlights. And so it's hard to understand when we're looking at Acts if we're not looking for it. But there are several years of gap in between all of these things. And so it's really trying to appreciate the real story. So it seems like, Paul is persecuting the Christians, he becomes a Christian, and then we have the Apostle Paul for the rest of the book of Acts. But that's not actually what happened when you start to look at Acts and what Paul says in his other letters. And so this is what you discussed. As was brought up by Brace and some others, when Paul becomes a Christian, he does immediately start to say, Jesus is God's Messiah. He does that right away. But he doesn't go on these world tours like we know him for. And he doesn't automatically assert himself as an apostle. He's just a regular guy in a lot of ways. He joins local church and he's a disciple and he's doing all of those things and he's preaching, but he's not what we know him as right away in terms of going around the world and being the foremost ambassador for Christ. And that is very easy to miss if we don't see the details there. But in those paragraphs that I have for you at the bottom of page 2 and then the top of page 3, it's just trying to piece together the rough story of what happened when you look especially at Acts and then what Paul says in Galatians. Because Paul gives us in Galatians 1 and 2 these records that basically go back into the decade of the 30s AD, which is extremely early. He says, this is what I was doing and where I was at, and this is who I talked to, and all of these things. And so basically what happens, and you talked about this, and I gave Brace it would help if it was on. I gave Brace some notes, and then this was written on the board, and I thought, I should have given him this in a PowerPoint so they didn't have to write it all out, but I forgot to do that. So this is basically it. It's probably going to be a little hard to read, but what is in front of you up there is just the events starting from when Paul is converted. Of course, I have Jesus is crucified first, up to the point that he's writing what we're talking about in 1 Corinthians 15. So what's everything that's happening in between there, from when Jesus dies and Paul is converted, to then when he writes down this tradition that we've been discussing here in 1 Corinthians 15. And so, just in summing that, so Paul, he's converted, right? And you guys noted that he's there for a few days in Damascus, and he can't see, and all of those things, and his sight is restored. And then that interesting phrase that he goes into Arabia for some period of time. And when you look at that, it's really interesting because the way that Paul uses it in Galatians and then the way it's used elsewhere, he's probably talking about the Sinai Peninsula, which would be, I believe, like Saudi Arabia today. He's just somewhere over there. And we don't know exactly how long, but we're told that he spends about 3 years in Damascus with the saints, right? And there's this plot to kill him, which he goes into more detail about in 2 Corinthians. The king of the Nabateans is trying to kill him along with the Jews. So the disciples get him out of the city. And that's, it seems, why he goes to Jerusalem for the first time. And when he goes to Jerusalem the first time, He's there for about 2 weeks, according to Galatians. He's preaching in the synagogues, and he tries to join the disciples, and as you talked about, they did not accept him for some obvious reasons, because this was the man that was trying to destroy our families and kill us, right? So they don't accept him. He's there for a couple weeks, and then Barnabas takes him, it says in Acts, to the apostles, and according to Galatians, that's just Peter and James at the time. So he meets Peter and James. He's there for a couple weeks, and then the Jews are trying to kill him again. And so they send him from Jerusalem on a ship back to his hometown of Tarsus, and he says that he spent roughly 14 years in the region of Syria and Cilicia, which would be where Tarsus is at. So sort of like southeast Turkey is what we're talking about. Southeast Turkey. He spends 14 years there. But when we're reading Acts, we don't really get that idea of the 14 years, do we? At some point during that 14 years, because he says it was 14 years between when I went to Jerusalem that first time and the second time for the famine relief. At some point during that, Barnabas comes and finds him in Tarsus and brings him to Antioch, and then that's where a lot of the story kicks off. But when you put all this on paper, you see that the way that the math lines up is there's about a decade, maybe a couple years more, where we don't hear anything from Paul. But again, that's not what it seems like when we're just reading through it. So there's about this period of a decade where there is not the Apostle Paul like we think about him, and then Barnabas comes and grabs him, and then he, in a way, becomes who we think about. So there's all this time, and of course, don't know exactly what's happening. We do know some things that happen. If you look at 2 Corinthians chapter 12, where it probably is most likely the case that Paul talks about, I know a man who had a vision, and he goes into detail about it, and I think he's talking about his own vision. He says, 14 years ago this happened, where I was taken up into heaven and shown all of these things. I don't know whether I was in my body or I was not in my body, but I was shown things that I can't even speak about. He says that was 14 years ago. And when you do the math, that would have been during that silent decade when he's in Syria and Cilicia. So he is receiving visions. He's learning with the other disciples. No doubt as a rabbi, he is poring back over the old law, trying to see what is it that I missed? How do I understand this Jesus? And reconciling all of that with the revelation that Christ is giving him directly. And all of that is to say, there wasn't just this flip of Paul the persecutor and then Paul the apostle. Because as Bryce brought up briefly, for me, if it was Paul was persecuting the Christians, and then all of a sudden he is in sort of the inner circle and one of the foremost people, I would start to ask, do you just like to be in the spotlight? What's your angle here? But we see a lot more of a human side. That there's this period of 12 years. He doesn't just jump right into being an apostle in the way that we think about it. And I think, for one thing, it shows a little bit of humility on Paul's part. He realizes, I guess I don't have this all figured out. And so he spends time just as a regular disciple, if I can say that. A regular disciple learning and doing these things. And we see this process. And then, at a certain point, he comes back into the public eye, and he writes the things that we hear, that we read from him, and he does the things that we see in the book of Acts, and he's the person that we see. And there's really not any more development. He's not coming to more understanding of the gospel at that point. He's got it figured out. And so it's fully developed. And I think a lot of that was probably maybe his wrestling during that 10 years or so. And so you guys talked about the significance, but I just wanted to go back over that and also ask, is there any questions that you have about this? Something that maybe you find interesting or that you haven't thought about before? Does it not make any sense? And you wonder, well, I don't know what you're talking about or why we're talking about this. What are you thinking as we're looking at this timeline and things?
I think think it's helpful because, as you point out, I mean, we go from Acts 9 when he's converted. At the end of Acts 9, he preaches in Damascus, then goes to Jerusalem for a little while, and then gets run out of Jerusalem. And then we've got him in Acts 11 in Antioch, and if you just read that
Right.
in sequential order in the chapters in Acts, it seems like, well, I mean, we might grant it a few months later or something, but the idea that it's a decade later is kind of you miss that. And so it's helpful to see that the book of Acts is not written to cover all of the things that happened during the period from when Jesus ascended to what we have at the very end of the book of Acts. There's a limited amount of information that's there in what took place. So it helps us to see that, I think.
We're being shown selective highlights in Acts. You know, Luke is bringing these out for a particular reason. So there's so much else that happened that we just don't have record of anymore, right? I mean, we'll look at a quotation from Paul in 2 Corinthians in a little bit, and there's so many things that he says in that we aren't even told in Acts, you know. And I think it just gives us a greater appreciation for what happened and the fact that these were real people and a real story happened. You know, it is just, it shows you more of the human element of Paul, I guess, and a greater appreciation for what is going on. Do we have anything else that we're thinking or want to say? Does this make sense, what I'm saying? Does this all make sense? I'm getting nothing from this side. Does this make sense?
Yes.
Okay. Again, if it doesn't make sense, it's not you, it's me in communicating it. So I want to know that so that we can make sure that everyone understands here. Yeah, Andrew.
Just another piece of it too is it paints a picture of some of the maybe the maturity of Paul. By understanding that there's these periods of time, we know that because Paul was described as young at the stoning of Stephen, he was seemingly young in the Pharisaical order, but then there's this time where he can mature and he's spent time with Christians, he's spent time learning and just living a life as a Christian too, so that when he then goes and preaches, he can be received maybe a little better as someone who does have some of that life experience. This is kind of a tangent, not really related. Well, it's a little related to the topic. I've seen theorizing before that Paul may have once been married. I don't know if you'd ever seen that or not. It's kind of based on some of the Sanhedrin and Pharisee traditions. They were typically married. It was kind of the known Jewish tradition at the time. So there's speculation. There's nothing in Scripture to indicate it, but speculation that Paul may have even at one time been married. Just knowing things about the experiences that he might have had can then help you later on see, oh, you know, he preaches so much about marriage and talks so much to married and unmarried Christians. Well, how is Paul, you know, what's Paul got to say about that? Why would anyone listen to Paul on that? And just, I don't know, to me it helps show he's not just a, I don't know how I'm trying to say this. Sometimes I guess there's a trope with some people are hesitant to listen to a young preacher because it's like, oh, well, he knows nothing but preaching. He hasn't experienced the things he's talking about. You know?
Yeah, I've felt that and I feel it in myself, yeah. As far as the marriage thing, I've heard that before, but I can't say anything either way. Just the fact that, yeah, we're not told anything about that. But it is really interesting because, you know, people are trying to crunch the numbers and take some guesses. When Paul goes to Jerusalem that first time and meets Peter and James, I've seen guesses that Paul maybe was in his mid to late 20s at that time. You know, Peter would have been in his late 30s, maybe early 40s, and Paul's in his late 20s. He's a young guy. So there is some maturing that happens. There is, you know, a process and some growing up, perhaps. And we miss a lot of that because, you know, we maybe don't look closely enough sometimes. But yeah, there's a lot more than meets the eye with a lot of this. Anything else that we want to add here? Nothing. All right. So then we take the step into looking at, okay, what change happened? You know, we see who Paul was before, we see what happened after, we see that there was this growth period, you know, that we can call for a while, where he's coming to terms and wrestling with the facts of what had happened. And just one example of that, let's actually look at this in detail. Go to Galatians 3. Galatians chapter 3. I want to look at something here as an example of what we're talking about. So if you go to Galatians chapter 3, and let's read, can someone read for us Galatians 3:13 through 14? Galatians 3:13 through 14. Volunteer.
Verse 13 beginning, Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us, because it is written, cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree, in order that in Christ Jesus the blessing of Abraham would come to the Gentiles, so that we could receive the promise of the Spirit by faith.
Anybody have any guess as to why I would bring this up? Andrew shook his head, so he's like, this guy is not making any sense right now. What did we talk about with Paul in terms of his initial understanding of who Jesus was?
He was anti-God's family, and he was accursed of God because of his method of killing.
He was accursed of God because he was hung on a tree. And that's what the law said, right? But then what does Paul say here in Galatians 3? Does he deny that Christ was cursed? No, he doesn't at all. He says Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. And, you know, whether he was directly given that truth or, you know, it took some wrestling and understanding, I don't know. But if we look at the human side of it, how long did it take Paul to come to that understanding, right? Jesus is a curse. That's what the law says. And here he says, yeah, exactly. That was the plan. So we see sort of this growth, this development. I want to point that out as an example where he says Christ was cursed because everyone who was hung on a tree, that was what the law said. But through that, he redeems us from the curse of the law, so that in Christ Jesus the blessing of Abraham might come to the Gentiles, so that we might receive the promised Spirit through faith. It's just amazing to see point A to point B in the development of understanding here. And again, Christ might have put this straight into his brain, and I don't know, or maybe he came to understand this later through his own knowledge. But I just find that incredibly interesting.
It would have been important to Paul that this realization that, yes, Jesus really was accursed, was also not contrary to the Old Covenant that he
Right.
grew up on. Because he knew that a Son of God would never contradict anything from the Old Covenant. So it was just a new way of understanding the curse and having a different perspective, but it was consistent with what he learned.
Right? It was. It fulfilled the law and everything that it said. And coming to understanding with that, I'm sure, was just revolutionary for a lot of people. Of, yes, this is exactly what happened, but what it means is not anything that anyone would have ever guessed before. So then in talking about this actual change, and so what we're going to be looking at is the change of Paul's willingness to suffer for Jesus. So he becomes willing to suffer for Jesus. And then we're going to talk about Paul's martyrdom, or his willingness to die for Jesus. And those two things show a lot about the change, the transformation that occurred in him. And I think the way that it's summed up the best is what we've talked about a few times in Galatians 1 and verse 23. He is quoting the Christians in Judea at the time. And he said they hadn't seen me, right, because they all ran away and didn't want to talk to him. Hey. They hadn't seen him, but they said, he who used to persecute us is now preaching the faith he once tried to destroy. And we take that for granted, of course, because we read this all the time. But put yourself in the shoes of those Judean disciples who heard that. Did you all hear that Saul of Tarsus has now started to follow the Lord, and he's preaching this? And just the shock that would have gripped everyone. And he goes even further than that. He didn't just preach him, but he was willing to go all the way. And so I want to look at this example of Paul's willingness to suffer for Jesus. And this is going to be 2 Corinthians 11. Now, I have all these extra slides that I forgot. 2 Corinthians 11. It is in the packet on page 3, or we can turn there. And can I get a volunteer to read that? 2 Corinthians 11, 24 through 28. Can you either read it off page 3 or out of your Bible? Addie.
From the Jews 5 times I received 40 stripes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I have been in the deep. In journeys often, in perils of water, in perils of robbers, in perils of my own countrymen, in perils of the Gentiles, in perils in the city, in perils in the wilderness, in perils in the sea, in perils among false brethren, in weariness and toil, in sleeplessness, often in hunger and thirst, in fastings, often in cold and nakedness. Besides the other things, what comes upon me daily, my deep concern for all the churches.
Okay, thank you. So in that context, right, Paul is talking about the genuineness of his apostleship and comparing himself to those who had been opposing him in Corinth. And he says, whatever anyone else dares to boast of, I have more to boast about. So are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they the offspring of Abraham? So am I. Are they servants of Christ? I'm a better one. He says, I'm talking crazy right now, but just bear with me here. And then he goes on into this description of really his resume as a servant of Christ. This is how far I've been willing to go for him. I am a better laborer. And so we see these lists of 5 times was beaten with the 40 lashes that we had talked about in an earlier class. Beaten with rods, stoned, shipwrecked, journeys over here, all of these different things. Are all of these details that he lists here, are these all found in the book of Acts? Can you find all of these in the book of Acts? Say, for instance, the 5 times beaten by the Jews. They're not all in the book of Acts. So again, there is so much more that Paul went through that we don't even know. As far as my understanding of the chronology, and I'm saying this off of my head and not the notes, he talks about, being in the sea. And where 2 Corinthians falls in the book of Acts, we don't have Paul's shipwreck yet. So there was multiple times where Paul was shipwrecked and was in the sea. And it was going to happen to him again after this. But all of these things that happened, they're not even all mentioned in Acts, as we said, because there's just so much more that happened. And the note that I have there at the bottom of page 3, at this point in writing, which is usually said to be about the year 55 or so for 2 Corinthians, Paul was going to have another 10 years or so of suffering. So this wasn't even all of it. The worst was really yet to come in a lot of ways. So he wrote this and said, this shows how dedicated of a servant I am to Christ. And he was going to have another decade where he suffered even more after writing this down. And so we are just getting a small sampling of Paul's experiences with what Acts is telling us. Again, because Luke wants us to understand specific things. But there is just so much. And then I bring up this idea from Galatians chapter 6 and verse 17. And you can look at it at the top of page 4. We won't necessarily turn there, but I have the reference. He says in Galatians 6:17, "From now on let no one cause me trouble, for I bear on my body the marks of Jesus." What does that mean? I bear on my body the marks of Jesus.
What he suffered for Christ,
Okay?
the beatings and the stonings and all that,
So how might we be able to see that on his body?
scars.
He was scarred. He was scarred, or maybe there was some kind of fresh wound, but his body showed his suffering for Christ. You know, when you're whipped 40 times, that doesn't usually heal very well. And so in some ways, Paul was mangled because of what happened. That was how far he was willing to go. And he was willing to go even farther than this. So number 1 at the top of page 4, considering all of the things we just talked about, and then the passages where he goes out to lay what we usually say is his pedigree of I'm an Israelite, I'm a Benjamin, I was a Pharisee, and all of these things. What did Paul sacrifice in changing his life this way? So let's talk about that for a minute. What did Paul sacrifice in changing his life this way? What did we think? Margaret?
He sacrificed his citizenship of his family, his credentials as a Pharisee. He sacrificed what his belief, and he just sacrificed himself to totally change his life and give up everything that he believed in. Because obviously we know that he had a lot of confidence in what he believed because of what he did. And he literally turned himself wrong side out.
Yeah, I like that. He did. He turned himself inside out for what was happening. And so Margaret brings up he sacrificed his family. We are told in Acts, I believe, about Paul's nephew. And I think it says his sister's son in particular. So Paul had a sister. He had at least one nephew. You know, do you think, we're not really told, do you think when Paul made this transformation, were they very happy with him?
If they were as dedicated as he to that religion, to their beliefs, then no, they wouldn't have that. We don't have an indication necessarily of that. You just think what happens many times when people obey the gospel and the things that they sacrifice for that. Often they are able to return to their family and believe in the truth, but that doesn't always happen.
Right. But yeah.
I think he still sacrificed the respect that he had among his peers.
Yeah, and that was the other thing that you brought up. So sacrificing his family, but then also sacrificing his standing as a respectable Jew. He in some ways threw it all away, and that's sort of what he talks about in Philippians chapter 3. All of these things are garbage. They don't matter. He was on track to go somewhere. Like we said, you know, he was educated, and he had a career plan laid out for him in that way. And he had standing in Jewish society, and he sacrificed all of that.
Yeah, Paul was like a watchman on the wall. He warned all. He made life and living death in Christ the gospel sake. He said, I'm not ashamed of it.
Yeah, he was absolutely resolute in all of this. So his relationship with his family, his career as a Pharisee, his standing in his community. Just think about another thing that we don't usually mention. Think about his friends. You think he had friends in the Sanhedrin and in the members of the Pharisees? And what happens to those friendships? Right. And a lot of those same people are the ones that he stands trial in front of later. And then not to mention, we've mentioned this already, but directly, he sacrifices his physical health. So sometimes he was homeless and didn't have, you know, in some of his letters he says, I didn't have enough clothing, I didn't have enough food. There were periods where he slept in the ocean because of shipwrecks. He sacrificed his financial well-being sometimes. You know, he did have his trade, and he did that sometimes. But it sure wasn't the cushy life that one could have as a Pharisee. And so he threw all of that away. And then, not to mention, he sacrificed his entire life. Sacrificed his entire life.
And eventually his wisdom.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's coming to mind for that is one of the things that he says again in Galatians is, I have been crucified with Christ, and it's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. Did his life show that? Absolutely. His life showed that. So then what does this willingness to suffer say about his conviction? What does it say about his conviction that he was willing to suffer all of those things that we read about and more?
Absolute.
Yeah, not a doubt in his mind, right? Not a doubt in his mind, I don't think.
I just thought about Paul, and one time Grace just said, Paul got it. He totally understood what it meant.
Yeah, he absolutely did. And there's no turning back from that. I mean, it's hard to really put it into words just how powerful the change is in him. And I think we can see even in Paul's own words that part of that was God's wisdom. He set Paul apart from before he was born. He said, I know who this man is going to be, and I know what I'm going to use him for. And what all of that testified to. It was just absolutely amazing. Paul was completely convicted. Andrew?
We said the same thing when we were talking about the apostles and how if they were in pursuit of fame or getting rich off of this or getting notoriety off of this, they went about it horribly because they lived such difficult and
Yeah.
destitute lives. And for most of the apostles, they came from pretty much nothing. Most of them were relative nobodies. And Paul was somebody. So he even lost in the eyes of the world. He turned out worse than before in many respects, the way the world would see it,
Yeah.
compared to even the other apostles.
In some of his trials, they say, Paul, you've absolutely lost your mind. You're nuts. You know, they thought that Paul had just gone completely crazy because of everything that he left behind.
Well, they couldn't imagine the exchange. They couldn't fathom why anyone who had not gone crazy would have tossed someone who was on such a track. And it's important that we don't underestimate that the loss of friends, the loss of standing, the loss of status, wealth, powerful career, all of that hurt just as much as it would someone who has no faith. It hurts just as much. He just said the pain was worth
Yeah.
the exchange.
What lies ahead is worth way more. So I want to bring up another example of this. So you remember in Acts 14, at Lystra and Derbe, what happened? What happens to Paul there in Acts 14? That's kind of a famous thing. We can turn there. Acts 14. So again, this is pretty early on in terms of what was going on. So this was, as is usually called, the first missionary journey. So Barnabas finds Paul and brings him, and they're in Antioch and all those things, and there were several years, and then the first missionary journey. And in chapter 14, you know, Paul and Barnabas are at Iconium, and then they're at Lystra, and when we come down to verse 19 of Acts 14, but Jews came from Antioch and Iconium, and having persuaded the crowds, they stoned Paul and dragged him out of the city, supposing that he was dead. So let's put that again in context. At the end of the first missionary journey, Paul is stoned and left for dead. And you all know what stoning is. Literally being pelted with rocks until you die. Paul was stoned and left for dead. But then let's read the next verse. But when the disciples gathered about him, he rose up and entered the city. What city did he enter?
Lystra. And the next day they
Yeah,
went to Derbe.
he enters Lystra and then goes to Derbe. What just happened in Lystra?
Stoned to death.
Those same people just threw rocks at him and tried to kill him. And he got up and went back into that same place where all of those people who had just tried to kill him were. What kind of insane person does that? What normal person would do this and give up everything that he lists in all of these autobiographical passages? Again, this is his first big trip, if you want to say that. And he's almost killed, and he gets up immediately and he goes right back into the people that just tried to kill him. And I cannot fathom a situation where I would do that. You know, I probably would have just turned around and went to Derbe instead. But this one who tried to destroy everything about Jesus was now convicted in his core that this man was the Son of God sent into the world, and that it changed everything, and that everyone needed to hear about it. And you see that in all of these things that he did. And so I wanted to bring up that example because I think it's really powerful. Are there any other details that you want to talk about or bring up?
I agree with you. It's hard to imagine myself doing that thing, doing what he did. It's probably unlikely that I'm preaching the next day anywhere, much less getting up and going back to Lystra. And then he goes to Derbe and goes back to Lystra again. So, I mean, it's just over. But from Paul's perspective, I think his mindset was these new Christians he's just converted in Lystra, he can't have them being weakened by him being almost killed.
Yeah.
So he goes back to strengthen them. But I mean, that just again gives us insight into how he thought and the kind of dedication he has. And it's just, I don't know, it's mind-boggling to me because by comparison, I feel so weak.
Yeah, forget the fact that I was just pronounced legally dead.
Yes.
You know, they need me.
Yeah.
And this is who we're talking about. It's amazing, this transformation that happens. And so then let's go to the martyrdom for the last few minutes of class. And I did have this on here. So I accidentally left the citation at the end of the paragraph, but this is the same thing that's on the middle of page 4, that indented part on in the middle of page 4. So he said Paul would not only suffer all of these things that we talked about, but ultimately he would die for the life that he chose. And so Eusebius, who's an early church historian who lived in the early 300s, he's writing in the early 300s, he reports this tradition about the martyrdoms of Peter and Paul, and this is usually regarded as being very trustworthy. So can I have somebody read this? Probably be easier if you read it off the middle of page 4. Volunteer to read that. Andrew's being handed the paper. He's reading.
In this way, when he, Nero, was the first to be heralded as above all a fighter against God, and raised up to slaughter against the apostles, it is related that in his time Paul was beheaded in Rome itself, and that Peter likewise was crucified. And the title of Peter and Paul, which is still given to the cemeteries there, confirms the story, no less than does a writer of the church named Caius, who lived when Zephyrinus was bishop of Rome.
Okay, thank you. So this talks about all of the things that the crazy man Nero was doing. So the early 60s. And he's fighting against God, and then he takes it upon himself to start killing the apostles. And Eusebius says, Paul was beheaded in Rome, and remember, he's a citizen, so he can't be killed like a regular person. And then Peter is also crucified, and what does he give as proof that this actually happened in this way? You could go and see their graves. And at that point in the 300s, he said their graves are still there. They were killed in Rome. Paul was beheaded, Peter was crucified. And I think about that all the time when you're reading the end of Acts, and you know the different places where Paul says, you know, I'm going to see you and then I'm going to go on to Spain. He never makes it to Spain. But he goes to Rome and he never comes back. And so what happens is he pays the ultimate price and literally pours himself out all the way and is killed for what happens. And it's a relatively reliable tradition that this happened. And Eusebius says you can still go and see the graves at that point and see for yourself that they died here. So we will pick up with some of this. Then on Sunday, what we'll focus on is starting with what explains this change.